If they want you to cut all night long, let see you cut. It didn't matter about you're tired, you're afraid to say you're tired.
Can you imagine being snatched away from your family in the middle of the night, bound by chains, and shipped off to murky pastures? What would it feel like to toil away in scorching heat at farms and plantations for hours on end and then shepherded like cattle, starved and parched? That too at the hands of your own people. That's what happened to millions of innocent souls for centuries. We blame many entities for the injustice of the past, be it the colonists or the enslavers, and rightly so. But a little exploration of history tells us that we are also responsible for the plight of our people. Maybe it's not about the colonizers or the colonized, or white versus black after all. Maybe it's human behavior, the privilege that imparts the freedom to do anything for certain benefits. The dark side of human nature can sometimes overpower the good side, regardless of race or culture. In the complicated volumes of man's history, there exist some chapters that show the dark side of humanity. It's unbelievable how greed could lead men and women to commit such despicable acts to fellow humans that seize their status of humanity. They considered humans as mere objects and trade goods that led to over 300 years of inhumane practices and a sinister international institution. However, when we think of the slave trade, we often picture white men going into African villages, chaining people who were once free and taking them away on ships to live as slaves. But that's not what happened to most of them. What is the hidden, painful truth behind the African slave trade? Who were the unseen people of this tragic saga? And what drove them to such inhumanity? This is a tale where everyone who got the chance profited off of the harrowing practice of denigrating humanity to mere property. The role of colonizing empires in promotion of slavery has been established and condemned for ages now. However, there was another whole empire that played a role in sustaining African slavery. The empire was neither white nor foreign. It was Africa itself, an actor that has remained obscured in the pages of history. This is a story about deep loss and pain. A reminder from history asking us, have we really made much progress since then? Welcome to Black History Diary. In this video, we elucidate the unexplored role of Africans in the entrenchment of the African slave trade. As you begin to become aware of this sinister institution, you will be astounded to know, just as we were, to see the lengths people go for collecting riches and keeping up appearances. Imagine people of flesh and blood, just like you and me, getting deprived of their humanity. Sons and fathers, mothers and daughters being separated from each other, all to fill the coffers of empires or to serve as a status symbol of elites. This practice of trading humans as mere goods plagued the world for over 3 centuries. The toiling away of millions of souls at the command of others was the characteristic of the world until around the 19th century. While there were several systems of slavery, the horrific stories of the Atlantic slavery remain a prominent part of history. The system was designed by the Europeans to arrange slave labor for their American colonies. The narrative surrounding the slave trade predominantly center on the European role in carving out this course of history. However, Europeans were not responsible for promoting slavery alone. Some Africans shared equal culpability in its perpetuation. While over 12 million Africans were shackled and forced into slave labor, many others produced, protected, and profited from their misery. Stay with us as we reveal a story often missed: how some Africans prospered and even built kingdoms on slavery. There is blood on the hands of Africans, and this blood belongs to our own people. You would be surprised to know that not only did African empires strengthen the institution of slavery, but they also resisted attempts by the European countries to end it. Have you ever wondered how far the roots of slavery go back in the world's history? It existed for a very long time, even before written history began. Slaves were present in ancient Egypt, engaged in plantation and the building of monuments. In ancient Carthage, a civilization in North Africa, It was common to trade slaves across the Mediterranean Sea. There are records of taking slaves in war by the Ethiopian kings of Aksum. Along with the indigenous use, slaves were also exported by Africa. All this was happening before the arrival of the Europeans. Trans-Saharan slave trade thrived way before the advent of European incursions. It spanned over thousands of years and ferried off around 10 million individual souls across the desert for servitude in the Islamic world. The Indian Ocean also served as a route for the slave trade. 5 million people were transported from it to become servants, workers, and soldiers. In the Islamic world, the demand for slaves was persistent due to the castration of male slaves, which necessitated the import of new slaves. And all this misery was not all due to the role of colonizers or foreigners. The Africans were equally or sometimes more responsible for it. Not many people realize, but Africa has blood on its hands. Blood of its own people spilled for their own interests. Understanding the history of African slavery helps us appreciate the complex legacy it left behind and how this legacy still impacts our world today. It sheds light on the deep-rooted social, economic, and cultural effects of slavery and contributes to the ongoing conversation about social justice and equality in our time. While West Africa was protected from the Islamic slave raids and was far away from the Indian Ocean, slavery still remained a significant part of it. Even before the advent of the Atlantic slave trade, West Africa witnessed several powerful empires that had intricate slave systems at their base. The Ghana Empire, that ruled from the 3rd to the 13th century, established powerful West African imperial states, while sourcing its extensive wealth either from the trans-Saharan slave trade or goods produced from slave labor. Similarly, the Mali Empire during the time flourished on the wealth and abundance spurred by gold, silver, and copper amassed through the toil of slave labor. The Mali Empire brought in female slaves from the Mediterranean to work as household servants for the rich. The succeeding empires adopted the same socio-economic structures and slavery systems. Empires such as Songhai, Jollof, and Kabul continued the acquisition of slaves while striving to set up their own territories. Slaves were a status symbol in these empires, and their presence boasted power and wealth on the behalf of the owner. Slavery had diverse uses in West Africa. Some slaves worked in the mines or on the land, whereas some of them even served as political advisors or soldiers, roles that are usually deemed as of an elevated nature. The status and rights of slaves varied from place to place. In some areas, slaves had permission to own land that they could cultivate in leisure time. They could buy their freedom with the money earned from the land. However, it was not all hunky-dory at other places. Slaves led miserable lives in other areas. For instance, in Benin, sacrifice of slaves was common practice. Ironically, their lives might not have mattered to their owners more than a tool or instrument, but they did matter to the deities or mystical powers that be. Slaves were sacrificed to signify important occasions, such as commemoration of a king's death. Before the Europeans arrived, many Africans were already being traded as chattels. What they found on their arrival was complex societies and powerful empires that thrived on slavery. In fact, for some of the Europeans, the roots of slavery were older than themselves. In 1526, the Portuguese initiated the transportation of slaves across the Atlantic to their American colonies aboard ships. This marked a novel development as slaves had previously been transported to Europe prior to the Portuguese arrival. Mostly, it was a trade between Africans and the Portuguese, where the slaves were sold to the incomers. While slave raids did happen at the time, where the Europeans overpowered the natives and dragged them to their ships and took them along, they were not a predominant phenomenon. Mostly, it was a routine sell-off of slaves by the Africans. Moreover, in the backdrop of the European arrival in West Africa, the Mali Empire was crumbling, and several states had emerged to claim territories. The struggle over land could have been bolstered by the incoming foreigners with their firearms. The competing rulers utilized the opportunity. Now, what could be the trade-off for the weapons? The numerous captives taken during war, They proved to be a lucrative currency to purchase weapons from the new coming foreigners. Weapons were not the only European thing that attracted Africans. Cloth and ceramic were a rage among African elite, as they would come in handy to showcase power and wealth. The African empires responded differently to the various opportunities arising from the slave trade with the Europeans. The Kingdom of Congo started dealing with the Portuguese in 1483. They annually sold thousands of slaves, fostering a reciprocal and intricate relationship between the two empires. The Congolese king, Afonso I, leveraged the Portuguese interest in slaves by dumping the excess slaves he captured during the expansionary wars on them. In slave trading, he had nothing to lose, as he had slaves in abundance and was getting material gains out of their trade. However, he ensured to have an upper hand on the slave trade. In 1526, he established rules for slavery in Portugal, including when someone could be enslaved. These rules also protected slaves who were not considered legitimate. They included the subjects of his own kingdom who were taken into slavery by opportunists or raiders. Aside from the Congolese Empire, the Akans of modern Nigeria showed the same spirit. They were ruling the Gold Coast and were eager to trade slaves, be it buying or selling. While the Kingdom of Congo was mostly interested in selling slaves, the Akans didn't have any preference. They needed human labor for the gold mines and purchased them from both African and European slave merchants. The same gold mines brought them a lot of wealth in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. By this time, around 1/3 of the population of several Akan states comprised slaves who mostly belonged to non-Akan ethnic groups. There was no incident of African solidarity against the Europeans that could be useful in terminating the slaves' misery. It might be because the Africans themselves were profiting from the slave trade. But why didn't the common people, those who stood the risk of getting enslaved, get together and resist? The answer to this intriguing question is the ethnic divide that ran deep and was way older than the arrival of Europeans. While the appearance of an external enemy tends to unite the people of a country, it didn't happen for Africans. The ethnic divide was entrenched and could not be bridged any sooner. However, it does not mean that resistance against the usurpers was non-existent. The coastal raiders used to attack the European slave ships. Whatever the spirit and intent of these attacks was, they were both ineffective and rare. The reason for this resistance was that those groups stood the highest risk of being enslaved. Nevertheless, their efforts mostly were unable to save them. Only one state came forward to resist European slavery, but for reasons very different from what you would be presuming. The state was the Kingdom of Benin, which was just a small area in present-day Nigeria. The Kingdom of Benin used to be a participant in slave trading, but this stopped in the mid-16th century when the state started experiencing a massive reduction in population, especially of men. Rulers who were robust in suspending the slave trade with the Europeans included Oba Asiji and Oba Orhobua. These two kings not only ended Benin's participation in the trade, but also shut the ports to the European traders. However, you should be aware that slavery was not abolished during that time. Only trade with foreigners was ended. What's interesting is that the same kingdom fought the British abolitionists to uphold slavery later by the end of the 19th century. Nevertheless, the response of different African empires to the European slave trade varied based on their circumstances. They supported the slave trade when it bore profits for them, and they prohibited it when they didn't find it lucrative enough. The Kingdom of Dahomey is the most infamous kingdom regarding slavery. The kingdom emerged on the map of the world in the 1600s at the southern coast of today's Nigeria. Dahomey saw its heyday in the early 18th century during the reign of King Ahijah. Ahijah amassed a lot of territories, all thanks to his well-armed, well-trained, and well-organized standing army. The army comprised 50,000 men or even more. Now, a big army comes as both an asset and a liability. It garners as many victories for the rulers as he wants, especially when it's highly capable. However, As soon as the ruler's incursions reduce, the army has time at hand which can be a condition ripe for rebellion. Hence, to keep the army busy, Dahomey either sent military missions to the neighboring states or on slave raids. Because of its military culture, Dahomey did not approve of men seeking other careers. If men were to join the army, who was going to take care of the other tasks like agriculture? Slaves were needed to carry out the non-military tasks. The slave raids were a good source to meet the demand. Moreover, in the 1720s, Dahomey had conquered the kingdoms of Alada and Waida. Both kingdoms have a thriving slave trading system. Tens of thousands of slaves were transported through their ports. When the two kingdoms fell, Dahomey consolidated the control of the prospering slave ports, which made it one of the most significant slavery powers of the time and history. Consistent slave raids combined with thriving slave ports led to a colossal slave population, so much so that by the end of the 19th century, 2/3 of the kingdom's population comprised slaves. This high prevalence rendered the slaves to be more than domestic servants and laborers. They became ingrained in the political context of the Dahomeyan society. The ownership of slaves evolved beyond mere possession. It became a prestigious status symbol for the Dahomeyan elites, setting the stage for a power struggle with the monarch. Although the slave trade is often portrayed as a royal monopoly, the absolute power of the monarch proved insufficient to restrain the ambitions of elites who, through their involvement in the trade, established formidable power bases. Along with politics and power, slaves became integral to the Dahomeyan religion. The annual customs of Dahomey unfolded as a combination of rituals and public celebrations featuring military parades, political debates, and a dark undercurrent of human sacrifice. This morbid ritual, performed to appease spirits and safeguard the kingdom, saw hundreds of slaves meeting their fate, often through decapitation. Astonishingly, on certain occasions, as many as 4,000 lives were sacrificed in a single day, an unnerving display repeated on similar scales during the funerals of monarchs. This haunting practice extended beyond royal ceremonies. It became an unsettling yet mandatory part of various rituals and social events, revealing the capacity of human beings to dehumanize their own. The entrenchment of slavery in the social, political, and religious fabric of the Dahomeyan society rendered the practice as an incumbent component of it. African empires maintained slavery for profit and power and resisted its abolition. When the European empires began to have a conscientious epiphany about the horrors of slavery, the African empires were not inclined to reconcile with this awakening. Dahomey is one such example. Given how deeply ingrained slavery was in the kingdom and how much it thrived on the slave trade, Dahomey was strongly committed to the practice despite the European pressure. However, this could not continue for long. King Gezo of Dahomey was compelled to oblige the conditions of the British in 1818. Those conditions included the eradication of slave sacrifices. Eventually, Gezo was asked to eliminate the slave trade. This time, he put his foot down. He told the British that the slave trade was the ruling principle of his people. It was glory and the source of their wealth. Their mothers lulled their children to sleep with the story of how they triumphed over an enemy and reduced them to slavery. However, Gezo had to sign a treaty with the British that eliminated slave trade from the Dahomeyan ports. This incident spawned resentment, but the Dahomeyans were resolved to continue the slave trade. They started using ports that were outside the gambit of the treaty for slave trade, but the seed for a conflict had been sown. And the resentment between the two empires only grew with time. It culminated in the severance of relations and Dahomey shunning away from the treaty entirely in the late 1850s. Dahomey forged an alliance with France that was less austere in its anti-slavery crusade. However, things had started to spiral for the African kingdom. The lapse in the slave trade and curtailed activities became a huge economic blow and diminished the kingdom's strength. Desperate, the kingdom orchestrated raiding and conquests. including in a French allied town in 1889. This drew French ire and led France to start 2 wars against Dahomey. While the French had a less strict stance on abolition, it didn't stop them from using it as a justification for further colonization. Deeming the abolition of slavery as a moral cause, the French legitimized the 2 wars, among many others, and finally overthrew the kingdom in 1894. The African empires thriving on the slave trade were caught between a rock and a hard place during the European abolition interventions. Eliminating the slave trade meant giving up the economic edge and a major source of wealth, whereas refusing to oblige to the European demand meant an attack on their territories anytime in the future. This also brings us to another common misconception that the European imperialism in Africa centered on slavery. The Europeans had laid claims to African land to fulfill their demand for slaves. It was true sometimes, especially in the case of Portugal. However, the anti-slave efforts fueled colonization more. Most of the European colonization happened after the abolition. One can say that whether they favored or disfavored slave trade, the European colonizers utilized it to further their imperialist ideas. Nevertheless, exploring the history of slavery reveals that a major actor has been overlooked while enlisting the factors behind this gruesome practice. While the European imperialists brought the slaves from Africa to their colonies, they weren't the ones who introduced slavery to Africa. Although they did play a role in its furtherance, they were not alone in accomplishing that. According to the latest numbers, millions of Africans were subjected to the death sentence of slavery. How many lives are we still sacrificing today? You might be relieved to know that the inhumane practice of slavery has mostly ended today. Sadly, it still exists in many places. Even today, the Africans are suffering from this sinister practice, and that too at the hands of their own. It's not only the civil wars, volatility, and insurgencies that trouble Africa. It's subjugation of humanity too. The rapid support forces of Sudan have been known to enslave many Sudanese. The witness testimonies reveal that they were sold by the militia and purchased as slaves to work on farmlands or as sex slaves. That is just the tip of the iceberg. We still have the blood of our people on our hands. The ethnic divides prove to be chasms for the social fabric that blind people and dehumanize other people. While colonization did initiate many inhumane practices, the role of our own people cannot be ignored. It's important to iterate the role of white people in slavery, but it's even more important to realize the dark shade of humanity that makes people do terrible things, irrespective of what color and ethnicity they belong to. While investigating this subject, we were appalled by the ethnic divides entrenched in various societies and how they led to the dehumanization of certain groups. While the institution of slavery has been abolished in modern times, the ethnic divide still prevails and needs to be tackled. How can we bridge such divides today? The first step would be to gather knowledge about them and spread awareness. That's what we've tried to do in this video. In a world where unity and understanding are more crucial than ever, these historical lessons can guide us. Every culture and every race have suffered from slavery, and mostly at the hands of their own people. Understanding the role that we played in the plight of millions in slavery enables us to take responsibility. It enables us to understand how the prospect of benefits and interests can make people oblivious to inhumanity and injustice. The way forward begins with this education and awareness that slavery was much more than just a black and white matter. It was the result of the evils human beings inherently conceal inside their sheath of civility. We really need to make sure this historical perspective becomes a part of what we learn in schools. This mission should involve diverse forces of historians, educators, activists, and the descendants of those affected by slavery. Creating platforms for discussion and reconciliation can help address historical wounds, dispel misconceptions, and promote unity among different communities. The role of Africans in American slavery cannot be overlooked. while browsing the unturned pages of history. But the question is it possible to shift the narrative from blame and guilt to learning and unlearning, regardless of historical grievances? Leave your comment below.